The Soviets sent the first man and the first woman to space, built the first space station, and landed the first spacecraft on Mars, Venus, and the Moon. The Cold War is usually considered a period of fear, a potential nuclear war, and espionage. However, if one was to look for positives, the most impressive accomplishments during this time resulted from the space race. The space race was not something either side set out to win. Initially, the US and USSR were only interested in becoming militarily superior to each other. This competition started by accepting and overlooking the atrocities the German scientists had enacted on their fellow men during World War II. Even before World War II began, German scientists had a reputation for their innovation and ability to solve problems. They gave the Germans an authentic military advantage through their devised weapons, including nerve and disease agents. When the Allies finally defeated the Nazis and trekked through Germany and the regions the Nazis had occupied, the Allied countries were shocked by the kinds of weapons the scientists had created. It quickly became apparent to the military leaders that bringing the inventive German scientists back to their respective countries would give them a distinct advantage. World Wars I and II left the world unwilling to engage in further combat, especially over something as abstract as ideology. Neither the US nor the USSR wanted to engage in open warfare. The result was a competition to see who could acquire the highest number of former Nazi scientists. In the US, Operation Paperclip was born. This intelligence program brought German scientists into the country, mainly in secret. As word spread of the horrors committed by the Nazis in concentration camps, the US government realized the problems that could arise if they were open about bringing German scientists home. The USSR faced a similar problem, especially with the animosity between the Soviets and the Germans. However, both governments decided that bringing Nazi scientists into their own countries was worth the advantage it would give them in the kinds of weapons they could develop. In total, the US brought more than 1,600 Nazi scientists back to the country. It is less specific how many scientists were brought into the USSR, as they were notoriously secretive. The US and USSR tried to minimize the activities of these scientists during the time they served under the Nazis. Both nations decided it was more important to have a weapons advantage than to hold these scientists accountable for the atrocities they oversaw. One of the most notable scientists rescued, perhaps not deserving of a second chance, was Wernher von Braun. Without von Braun's contributions, first in Germany and later in the US, the events of the next few decades would have likely played out very differently. After spending some time in the military, von Braun entered a doctoral program at the University of Berlin. He was the technical director of the German project to produce V-2 ballistic missiles, which people in concentration camps constructed. Von Braun had been to the facility where the ballistic missile was being made several times as the director of Peenemünde. Following his surrender in 1945, von Braun was brought to the U.S. and put to work at Fort Bliss near El Paso, Texas. His war record was covered up so he could continue his career in the U.S. with other German scientists. The team was moved to Huntsville, Alabama in 1950, where they built missiles. Eventually, von Braun became a big proponent of putting more effort into space travel. Though his time with the Nazis has certainly tainted his legacy, there is no doubt that von Braun was instrumental in the U.S. success in the space race. His interest in space did not diminish over time, and he was even concerned that his record would undermine NASA's reputation. It was partly due to this concern that he waited until after the successful Apollo 7 mission at the end of 1968 before he gave his interview regarding the SS military members. The other notable scientist in the space race was Sergei Korolev, a Ukrainian who eventually became another victim of Stalin's paranoia. However, he left his mark on the direction of the space race in the USSR. He provided the Union a distinct advantage in the race that dominated the global news during the 1960s. Korolev was the man who provided the first real successes of the space race. After founding the Group of the Study of Reactive Motion, Korolev developed what became the first Soviet rockets in 1931. By 1933, the Soviet military had taken control of the group, becoming the first official part of developing missiles and other potential weapons. Korolev focused on space, while another scientist, Valentin Glushko, worked on propulsions. Korolev was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor during Stalin's purges, but served less than 3. 4 months of that tenure was in the Gulag, After the war ended, Korolev was tasked with a new research center with German scientists. He and his team developed the first intercontinental ballistic missile with a range of 7,000 kilometers, far surpassing the German V-2. Sergei Korolev became known as the father of the Soviet Union's success in space. However, he did not live to see his most significant success. After being diagnosed with cancer in 1965, he chose to undergo an operation. He died during the operation in early 1966. His project to land a craft on the moon succeeded within a month. Without him, the Soviet space program suffered and began to fall behind the US. Glushko, who had become Korolev's nemesis after getting him arrested, took over the projects but did not have the knowledge or abilities of the man he had once denounced. Even today, the Russians still use the plans Korolev had drawn up for future progress. The US was trailing behind Korolev in the early 50s, but had been steadily working toward getting satellites into space since the people in the US were very interested in space exploration at the time. Ever since the panic inspired by Orson Welles' War of the Worlds broadcast over the radio in 1938, interest in aliens and what could be found in space had inspired Americans' imagination. As the curiosity toward the unknown, including the Soviet Union, especially in light of their nuclear program, descended into paranoia, the US wanted to monitor USSR territories. To establish this kind of regular surveillance as an acceptable practice, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower proposed in 1955 that the US and USSR agree to allow flights over each other's territories. His proposal was called Open Skies. Unsurprisingly, the USSR rejected this idea. Following the rejection of this policy, the US government decided it could accomplish longer-term surveillance at a lower cost by sending a satellite into space. The satellite would provide surveillance every time it went over Soviet lands. If the US could do this successfully, it would not be risking any American lives, since the satellite would be unmanned. Secondly, the USSR would not be able to eliminate it, since missiles were not powerful enough to reach space. And even if they could, they were not sophisticated enough to accurately hit a target outside Earth's atmosphere. In May of 1955, the US began to move on the project. Having adopted a policy of relative openness and honesty about what it was doing, the US announced it on July 29, 1955. President Eisenhower spoke to Americans, telling them that the US was dedicated to creating a satellite that would help keep the country safe. He also asked for companies to start submitting proposals to develop the satellite. While the US was beginning to look for proposals, the USSR already had Korolev's ideas firmly established, giving them a nearly 2-year advantage. Initially, the talks started internally, with Korolev presenting his satellite ideas to the Military Industrial Commission in August of 1955. The commission soon approved his proposal to use one of its new launchers to send a satellite that weighed 1.5 tons into space. The decision was not unanimous, as several missile specialists thought focusing on satellites would be a problem in developing ballistic missiles. Korolev had helped persuade many of the commission to agree by saying he would be able to launch before the start of the 1956 IGY. IGY was an international program that lasted from 1957 to 1958 and was implemented to collect information and research and study geophysics and the planetary environment of Earth. While there was a buy-in for the program, the Soviet Council of Ministers was slow in its announcement, waiting for the early part of 1956 to officially authorize the program. Korolev had proposed his satellite to the Military Industrial Commission in the summer of 1955. He provided a timeline that would have launched a satellite before the start of the IGY. Unfortunately, the delayed authorization put the plans behind schedule by several months. Khrushchev was concerned that the satellite would adversely affect the missile program's progress. Korolev persuaded Khrushchev of the product's value and ensured that it would not interfere with the missile project. With this assurance, Khrushchev endorsed what soon became the most advanced space program. It was Korolev's persistence that ultimately pushed the USSR to be the leader in the space race. The US was working toward this goal when the USSR announced it would launch a satellite during the IGY. With many Americans seeing this as a potential threat, they quickly looked to the US government to ensure they were first. Unfortunately, they were lagging far behind the USSR. On the other hand, the Soviets were also running into issues. Korolev realized that their current plan would not meet the targeted deadline, so at the beginning of 1957, Korolev reduced the designs to form two simpler satellites called the PS-1 and PS-2, which were only about 220 pounds each. PS was short for Prostorch Sputnik, which translates as simplest satellite, indicating a switch to a simpler version. This change required approval to proceed, which the Soviet Council of Ministers finally gave in the middle of February 1957. Once it had a successful test, the Soviet Union decided to announce its progress to the world. This announcement was met with skepticism in the US. On October 3rd, Korolev and his team began to prepare for the launch. Once the equipment was set up, the Russian team began to fuel the rocket at 5:45 a.m. 16 hours passed before everything was ready, and the R-7 launched the PS-1 into space. 6 minutes after the rocket launched, it ejected the PS-1 into the atmosphere. At some point, the satellite received a new name, Sputnik, which roughly translates to traveling companion or fellow traveler, depending on the translator. It would come to be known as Sputnik 1. Today, Sputnik is often synonymous with the term satellite, showing just how vital this remarkable accomplishment was. Sputnik 1 continued to circle the Earth for a few more months, staying in orbit for roughly 3 months before falling back to Earth. On November 3rd, the Soviets followed this success with Sputnik 2, a satellite that carried the dog Laika, the first living creature to be shot into space. The US was playing catch-up, but it successfully launched its first satellite on January 31st, 1958. The US may not have been the first to reach space, but it was the first to transmit signals back from space. Their satellite, Explorer 1, was also a cosmic ray detector that provided scientific data that helped scientists better understand the area around Earth's atmosphere. While the USSR focused on quick accomplishing, the US tried to learn from each mission. The Americans met many of the same goals as their Soviet counterparts because they also gathered data. While slower to reach space, the US sent Explorer 1 higher than the Sputniks had gone. After the failed mission of Explorer 2, the US launched the solar-powered Vanguard 1 into space on March 3rd. In May, the Soviets sent Sputnik 3, a satellite more advanced than all the previous ones, US or USSR. Sputnik 3 had a recorder that failed to work correctly, which meant it could not complete all the planned objectives. At nearly 3,000 pounds, it was the heaviest satellite to reach space during this time. While the recorder did not work as intended, the 12 instruments on board provided data on a range of Earth measurements, including the upper atmosphere, radiation, cosmic dust, and the Earth's magnetic fields. In April of 1960, Sputnik 3 finally returned to Earth. The space race was one of the finest sagas of the Cold War, and although the Soviets were ahead most of the time, the US was always right next to them. With NASA's contributions to the space race, the US contributions became far more impressive in the long run. Despite the political drama surrounding it, watching rockets fly into the unknown would have been a marvelous sight. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about the space race, check out our book, The Space Race, a captivating guide to the Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union to reach the moon. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.